As we begin our study of Victorian literature, let's review some of the historical background on the Victorian period. As you remember, England united with Scotland, Ireland, and Wales to become Great Britain through the Act of Union of 1707. Britain was the first country to become industrialized, um, which happened earlier than many of us think. It really was taking place in the 1740s and 1750s. So even before the American Revolution, Britain was becoming uh, industrialized. And you'll remember from your 3314 class that William Blake talked about the dark satanic mills. And Blake was writing in the 1780s and 90s. So industrialism took place, was well entrenched by the period we're talking about, the Victorian era in the 19th century. Throughout this period, and even before, there was a definite shift from an agricultural model of the economy to trade and manufacturing being the main source of wealth in the British Isles. And from 1870 on, Britain was so intertwined with international commerce that she was considered the world's banker. And the Bank of England was the standard and was considered the most stable and secure currency in the world. Because the Bank of England was located in London, London became the world's most influential city. Now, I say that influential in the sense of trade and um, um, the economy, not necessarily culture and the arts. That would be um, Paris would have been the cultural capital of Europe at this time, and Germany would have been the intellectual capital, um, with the German universities as greatest in the world. So, but now we're going to break it down and look at some of these factors separately. The agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, constitutional government, Methodism, and imperial markets. So these component parts of the first change in agriculture that started back really in the 14th and 15th centuries were that large landowners stopped the common practice of allowing their workers to use waste ground or what was called common land. It wasn't actually common, it was owned by large landowners, but it was assumed that large landowners needed to allow their workers a place to raise their own animals and to grow their own gardens so that they would not be so dependent on the landowner. This was allowing, so it was a common agreement among landowners that they would let their workers have um, a kind of a gig economy. So, in addition to providing labor for the landowner, the um, the farm workers would be allowed to have their own um, uh, individual plots of land and their own animals. The Enclosure Acts meant that common understanding that farm workers could have a place to grow their own food was gone, and that hurt them and made their lives less secure and less healthy. At the same time, there were many inventions that helped to improve agriculture. Two that I note were improvements in farm implements, such as Jethro Tull's seed drill, and yes, I know Jethro Tull is a rock band, but um, he was famous for inventing this um, seed drill to get seeds deeper in the ground. The other invention was an innovation in crop rotation. And as you may know, crops quickly exhaust the soil. Our modern solution is to lay on chemical fertilizer, which is quite expensive. The ancient solution was to rotate crops among different fields in a cycle. Originally, a two crop rotation. One field would be under cultivation, the other field would be left fallow. The animals would graze on the seed hulls or the uh, stems and whatever was left in the fallow field after harvest, and would leave their droppings there to fertilize the field. And that was a way of making sure that the fields return to fertility. Um, However, in the mid 18th century, a method of crop rotation from Holland was brought over by Charles Townshend, whose nickname became Turnip Townshend. And Turnip Townshend brought this four crop rotation. So you divide your fields into four parts. The first part would be planted in wheat, second part in turnips, third part in barley, and the fourth part in clover. Now, clover, as you may know, is nitrogen fixing. And so anywhere you plant clover, not only is it good for animals to graze, but it fixes nitrogen in the soil, which improves the soil for the next crop that's planted there. And of course, turnips could also be eaten by livestock. That was a good food crop. And the wheat and the barley were good for making bread for humans. So this improved the fertility of fields and meant that more food could be provided with less work. Um, the another uh, um, However, prices for food were kept artificially high by what were known as corn laws, and corn was considered to be any of the cereal grains, not just corn on the cob like we think of. Um, Wheat, barley, and rye were all considered to be corn um, because they were the crops that made bread, which was the common food of the common people. The um, the corn laws protected British farming, but the problem was British farming could not keep up with the population. As agricultural methods improved, more food was able to be produced with less work. But by keeping the price of this food artificially high, poor people could not afford it. And so, from very early on, um, those trying to work with and help the poor wanted to get rid of the corn laws. And that finally happened in 1846. Where do you go if you are an agricultural worker without a job? Chances are you'd go to a city um, where manufacturing was taking place, and manufacturers were always looking for workers that they could train in to work in factories. The first of these factories um, were the textile factories. Why? Everybody needs to wear clothes. Very profitable, and a home market. Everybody would like to have cheap clothing. And if the goods were produced in a factory, there were a lot of them able to be produced through the use of machinery much quicker than if your mother was at home um, spinning the wool, um, weaving the cloth and making the shirts. And so the textile industry was something that um, could be marketed to every single person in the country, and the fact that they could do this much faster than people could at home was a big plus, and meant that they could sell a lot of volume of these items. The other important industry from very early on was the pottery industry. Everybody needs dishes, cups, plates, saucers, um, cooking pots, and Britain had a fine supply of clay that was suitable for making pottery, and um, and so this was early on when this was able to be mechanized a bit. It was considered a very useful um, and important item for sale because everybody needed some form of pottery in their homes. Foreign markets, on the other hand, when everybody has all the clothes they need, everybody has all the plates and cups they need, where do you send the extra? Foreign markets were very important for two reasons. They were often a source of raw materials. The cotton in British textile manufacture, Britain did not have the climate to grow cotton and was dependent on two sources primarily, the American South before the Civil War, and then India. And but British, um, having gotten the raw materials, Britain would sell the products that they created out of those raw materials back to those countries that had provided the raw materials at a considerable profit. And so um, both getting raw materials from various places around the world and then selling those same people back the finished products really helped to develop British trade. Theories of capitalism might be good to know about. Again, capitalism, the idea that by investing in um, in these industrial ventures, um, investors could make a good profit, even if they themselves were not providing the service. They, by investing small amounts in various products, um, industry became more and more successful. Adam Smith wrote a seminal book, same year as the American Revolution, The Wealth of Nations, in which he postulates that labor is the real wealth and that governments should let markets determine their own value. In other words, governments should not put taxes on products moving in and out, that businesses will regulate themselves. Because why? Because of the law of supply and demand. If there is a great demand for something, producers should be able to charge more. If there's less of a demand, then prices will automatically decrease, and that this is how the economy should function. Jeremy Bentham is another very important industrialist, or not industrialist, he didn't own anything, um, economist, who's credited with being the father of utilitarianism. If Adam Smith was the pioneer of laissez-faire, let it alone economics, government stay out of business, Jeremy Bentham believed that for the good of the country, um, the needs of the many should outweigh the needs of a few. And he saw basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter, as the most important needs that anyone had. He believed that good government provided the greatest good for the greatest number, and that the economy should indeed provide the greatest good for the greatest number. Now that sounds like a really good thing, but he doesn't believe in things like art, literature, music as being worth anything at all. That government should focus on the material needs for food, clothing, and shelter before thinking of anything else, because those are the needs that the largest number of people are really concerned about. Um, Obviously, for a discipline like literature or the humanities, there's some problems with that line of thinking. Another economic pioneer was Thomas Malthus, who was a minister, um, and he noted that in his parish, many of the poor had very large families, and he saw how this large population increase caused miserable poverty. His solution was that the poor should not breed, that the poor should limit the number of their families. What's interesting is we see in more recent times in industrialized countries that people just naturally have fewer children when their economic situation is better. That's why population growth has really slowed in the United States, where we have enough food. Um, for some reason, it just kind of naturally works that way. But Malthus believed that the way to improve the country was to limit population. Britain really profited from her constitutional government. Why? Because you need a stable government in order um, for business to prosper. Britain had had a parliamentary system of government since 1215, the Magna Carta, when the king was forced to share power with the nobles, and Parliament had met with some regularity in the intervening period. But a real watershed, and what we normally consider the beginning of the Victorian period, is not Queen Victoria coming to the throne, but the date of the first Reform Bill. And there were three major reform bills throughout the 19th century. But the first Reform Bill in 1832 was the most radical one, because it was a way of making representative government more fair for the larger, now more influential industrial areas, um, which had not been, whose representation had not been updated. Here in the United States, we have a census every 10 years to determine where are the centers of population and making sure that places with more people get more representation. That did not happen in Britain for hundreds of years, with the problem being that with more people moving to the cities, those cities still had far fewer representatives than empty country districts. And of course, that wasn't fair, but there wasn't really a mechanism to fix what were so called rotten boroughs. That is, boroughs that had very few people in them but had multiple representatives. And therefore, this reform, the greatest achievement of the Reform Bill, first of all, was that it more fairly allocated representation into more populous districts. It also enfranchised more men. No women voting at this time, of course, but all men were not able to vote either. You had to own a certain amount of property, and the amount of property you had to own changed throughout all three reform bills. There was still a considerable property required for voting in this bill, but there were more people enfranchised through this legislation than previously. Queen Victoria, again, the her even though as a constitutional monarch, she didn't have a whole lot of influence on government. She was still revered as head of state. She was still consulted and uh, apprised of all that was going on in Parliament. She was still beloved by her people and provided a figurehead for government that spoke of solidarity and um, continuity of government, um, stability, safety, um, and she was an important figurehead, shall we say, for ensuring the continuity of British life and customs. Another important factor in the historical mix of the 19th century, believe it or not, was Methodism. And yes, I mean uh, Methodism like the United Methodist Church down the street from you, or maybe a Methodist church that you attended as a child. Um, uh, Halevi, a French historian, believes that Britain was saved from the kind of revolutions on the continent. What were those revolutions? Peasants revolted against the aristocracy who neglected to um, consider them in terms of treatment, um, who were cruel, had followed cruel policies, and did not share the wealth with the workers. Halevi postulates, and I think he's largely right about this, that the religious revolution, the development of Methodism in the late 18th century, early 19th century, prevented Britain from having those kinds of revolutions. What am I talking about? Methodism did not start out as a new Christian denomination. It was practiced by Church of England priests, such as John Wesley, in the 1740s. Um, and Wesley felt a call to preach to the lowest members of society, people who were often forgotten by the churches. He believed that Church of England priests had become lazy and were not living the gospel in the way that they should. And so this was a religious revival and a call to live more like the disciples in the early church in Acts of the Apostles. It was a method of living, hence the name Methodism. It was not a separate church. These were Church of England clergymen. In the United States, we would call them Episcopalians. Episcopal meaning bishops, ruled by bishops. Um, but the idea that the masses were being evangelized, because previous to this, the church had very much been allied with the government. Um, and people, ordinary people, working people, felt that the church was allied with the government against them and backed the employers, backed the landowners, backed the factory owners, and not them. What Methodism did was take the Christian gospel to the ordinary people through every means possible. John Wesley went on preaching tours all around Britain and the United States, for that matter, in what is known as the Great Awakening. Um, his brother Charles Wesley composed many hymns, and the Christian gospel was spread through the use of hymns sung to popular tunes many times, um, to get across the ideas of the Christian message to people who maybe couldn't even read. Anyway, the idea that people turn to God rather than to revolution is what Halevi is talking about here. In the 1790s, so Charles Wesley was active in the 1740s and 50s. I'm sorry, John Wesley was the evangelist. Charles Wesley was the hymn writer. 1790s, the missionary movements. Um, there was another awakening in religious circles and a belief that people needed around the world needed the Christian gospel and that Christ could not come back. The world could not end until every person on the globe had heard the Christian message and had an opportunity to choose to follow Christ. And because of this, then, a great missionary impetus started again. This coincided with the formation of the British Empire, and many people feel that the two things are related. In fact, I think it's it perhaps it's related, but in its inception, the two movements were separate. But religious people had political power, and that's the point of all of this, and reminding you about this. And the most obvious way that religious people had power was through their lobbying against the slave trade. The so-called Clapham sect were evangelical Christians. Many of them were Anglicans, but they were evangelical in that they believed in spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ and that they needed to be active in their faith, that they needed to follow the teachings of Jesus, to care for the poor and the dispossessed. And they saw slaves, the African slave trade, as the primary example of people who were being dispossessed. Um, through their active political intervention, slavery was outlawed in Britain in 1807 and outlawed in British colonies by 1833. The British Empire, according to the Robinson Gallagher thesis, was an empire that was unlike the empires of old, the Roman Empire, the empire of Alexander the Great. Those empires were started by armies out to conquer territory. Um, the British Empire, according to Robinson and Gallagher, was an empire of trade, and that changes the complexion of the British Empire. Um, when the British again, because they developed industrialism and had a great need for raw materials for their industrial processes, they were willing to go to various places marked in dark type on this map. They were willing to go to many places on the globe to collect raw materials for manufacture back in Britain. In order to get people to trade with them, Britain did the same thing that many European powers did. Um, they got groups of natives to cooperate with Britain against other groups of natives. An example of this would be the situation in Rwanda that led to the terrible genocide of the mid 1990s in that country. Historically, the French had favored or I should say the Belgians, favored the Tutsi tribe, and promoted them over the neighboring Hutu tribe. The Hutus finally used that favoritism, the fact that many government positions were taken by Tutsis and Hutus were locked out, as a reason to um, try to kill all the Tutsis. This anger boiled over in the 1990s and was the focus of the Rwandan genocide. But again, this method of using one group of natives to fight against another group of natives for the benefit of the British was a common tactic. Now, I just told you that British evangelicals fought bitterly against slavery and got the British Empire to get rid of slavery. I firmly believe that's true. History bears that out. But slavery is one of the things that helped to found the British Empire. And that historical fact, that historical stain, that historical guilt really motivated the British to um, kind of self-righteousness and to fight against other empires, other European powers who still supported slavery. It was against British self-interest to get rid of slavery, but through the evangelical influence, it did happen. So important dates uh, in the early years of Victoria's reign, 1830 to the Liverpool to Manchester Railway. Liverpool was a port where raw materials came in. Manchester was the industrial city. So important to have transportation quickly and easily from the port to the manufacturing center. 1832, the first Reform Bill, as we've already talked about. 1833, slavery, which had made British um, imperial dominance possible, um, was outlawed. And that seems to go against British self interest. I think it did. But the humanitarian lobby, through the evangelical Christians at home, made that a requirement, even though it was against British self interest. 1833 Factory Act made it mandatory that children younger than 9 could not work in factories. Up to that time, very young children had been employed in factories and often met with sad accidents. 1842, the Mines and Collieries Act was passed. This act forbade women from um, working in mines at all. And yes, before that, women had worked in mines. What's interesting is the main reason this act passed was those who had been, again, this is the same um, evangelical humanitarian effort that had gotten slavery outlawed in the empire, came home and looked at conditions at home in Britain and said, this is unacceptable in a Christian nation. We have to do something about this. So women often took their blouses off and worked in their underwear in the coal mines because it was so hot. And that fact that women were working in their underwear or even took all their clothes off and had no clothes on was considered just a terrible thing. That men would see women without any clothes on. It was considered lewd and just bad practice. So the Mines and Collieries Act forbade that and also limited the age of children who could work in factories. I'm sorry, in mines. 1846, repeal of the Corn Laws meant cheap bread for everybody. 1848, defeat of the People's Charter. That's a sad thing. The People's Charter, or Chartism, was Britain's form of rebellion on the continent. Working people were taking up arms against the government. In Britain, they tried to do it legally by asking Parliament to pass the People's Charter, which included things like universal manhood suffrage. They didn't get that until the 1880s. Um, um, Rights of workers to organize, that didn't happen for 20 more years. But again, the people were doing this in what they considered to be a legal way rather than using violence or force. So, what are Victorian values that we see in literature? Again, here's Queen Victoria in a representation of her with her husband, Prince Albert, and 5 of their 9 children. They were considered the prototypical Victorian family. They paid income tax like everybody else. They were considered to be models for the Victorian times. Earnestness. If you could change something in society that wasn't right, you needed to do it. What was valued was not living a luxurious life, but living a useful life. Moral responsibility. Again, if these are Christian values, these are values of that should be operative in society. If that we those in power have a moral responsibility to make life better for those at the bottom of the social scale, and the integrity of the domestic sphere. That home life is the place where these values are learned, and that husbands and wives, husbands as well as wives, have a duty to help create a stable home life for their children. And so, the most important thing that fathers and mothers can do is to offer support and guidance to their children. And that may seem obvious, but again, other times in British history stressed other kinds of values, but certainly in in this early period of the Victorian century, domestic propriety was stressed. So now you have a bit of a basis for thinking about Victorian literature. We're going to now turn to the Victorian virtue of work in a couple of important pieces of Victorian poetry. The latest Decalogue by Arthur Clough, and um, some writings by Thomas Carlyle, the apostle of work. Again, Carlyle lost his religious faith, but he found purpose, as we can see from these Victorian values. He found purpose in the idea of working to a purpose, working to improve humanity in some way, working just for the sake of work, that the work itself, doing something earnestly, doing something difficult, seeing it through, has a value in itself, even if you're not sure about your religious values or what God wants you to do, or you don't believe in God. It's still important to work and express yourself through your work. And then uh, Tennyson's great poem Ulysses, in which he imagines Ulysses, the hero of the Odyssey, as an old man looking for one more adventure, one more noble work to do. Um, Enjoy.